Chapter 16 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 16. Now that she could no longer entertain, Deb refused to be entertained, much to the discontent of Frances, who pined continually for a larger and brighter life, so that the invitations fell off to nothing before the excuse of the deep mourning was worn out. But when Mrs. Urquhart, always maternally solicitous for her poor Sally's girls, wrote to beg them to spend Christmas at Five Creeks, Deb and Frances, who did not, for different reasons, wished to go themselves, agreed that it would be the very thing for Rose to do so. She would be absolutely safe up there, and with her old social world about her, and old interests to occupy her mind, would recover that respect for herself which seemed to have been more or less impaired by association with suburban villadom. They hoped she would stay at Five Creeks a long, long time. "And if only Jim would keep her altogether," sighed Frances. "I would be content with Jim now." "I wish to goodness he would," said Deb, with fervour, not thinking particularly of her sister as she spoke. The matter was put to Rose, and she consented to go. Five Creeks was better than Lorne, which had been spoken of, and the companionship of Alice than the shepherding sisters in the close limits of seaside lodgings. Besides, Rose was a born bush girl. She was tenderly escorted to Spencer Street, and put into the hands of Jim himself, in town on station business. Alice met them at the other end, and the two friends slept, or rather bunked, together, the house being full for the Christmas dance, and talked the night through, but not a word about Peter Breen passed Rose's lips, so full of words as they were. Next day the trestle tables and Chinese lanterns, the sandwiches and creams, and what not, occupied her every moment and thought until it was time to dress, when the interest of the ball itself became supreme. "Well, there's one good thing," said Alice, as, hemmed into a corner of a small room crowded with girls, she laced Rose's bodice. "We shall not want for men. There'll be one to each girl, and three over. The Simpsons alone have promised to bring 6." The Simpsons were new people at Bundaboo, which Mr. Thornycroft had let. He now lived at Redford, in a third part of the great house, the other 2/3 being closed. He was not coming to the ball, Alice said, getting too old for balls. In their white frocks and flowers, the friends went to the drawing room, and in the thick of the arrivals Jim brought up from the bachelors' quarters the 6 Bundaboo young men. Mrs. Simpson introduced them to Mrs. Urquhart and her bevy of assistant hostesses. "Mr. Leader, Mr. Henry Leader, down from Queensland. Mr. Parkinson, English, globe-trotter. My 2 sons, whom you know, my nephew, Mr. Breen." Thus do the sportive fates love to make mock of the most carefully laid family plans. Rose and Peter faced each other, sharing one blush between them. Their natural pleasure and astonishment was only equalled by their mutual admiration. "What a little love she is in that pretty gown," thought he, a connoisseur in gowns. "And who would take him for a draper now?" thought she, noting the vigorous frame and the perfect correctness of its garb. As a matter of fact, no one did take him for a draper, and no one cared what he was, since he was Mrs. Simpson's nephew and a man. As soon as it was understood that a previous acquaintanceship existed between them, Rose was given Peter to take care of, to show round and introduce. They walked off, elated. "Well, I never expected to see you here," said she. "Nor I," said he. "I thought I was never going to see you any more. How is your mother? How is dear Bruce? Will anyone take him for walks while you are away? How terribly he will miss you." "Well, it is something to be missed, even by a dog. What a nice face your aunt has. Is she your father's?" "No, my mother's. They are very much alike. But you don't know my mother." The blessed Urquhart children romped up to them at this opportune moment, thrusting forward their basket of programmes. Rose and Peter each took a card, and Peter proceeded to business. "With pleasure," said Rose. And then, "Oh, if you like. Well, only one more round. One. I belong to the house, and must distribute myself." "No, no, that's enough. Leave room for all the nice girls I am going to introduce you to. Miss Alice Urquhart, Mr Breen, dear Mrs Simpson's nephew, and a friend of mine in town." It slipped out unawares. Peter's air, as he scribbled Miss Urquhart on his card, was seraphic. Later, Alice snatched a chance to whisper to Rose, "What a good-looking fellow! Who is he?" And Rose hastened to explain that she knew him only very slightly. They had their first waltz together, and he danced delightfully. This was a fresh agreeable surprise to Rose, as if drapers did not take dancing lessons and make use of them like other people. She was almost indiscreet in her eulogies on his performance, but there was not room for all, or half, or a quarter, to dance at once, and the crowded house was hot, and the night outside soft, dry, delicious, and the Five Creeks garden was simply made to be sat out in. So presently Rose and Peter found themselves leaning over a gate at the end of a long, sequestered path. "That," said Rose, nodding towards open paddock, "is the boys' cricket ground. They play matches in the holidays with the stations round. That fence leads to Alice's fowl yards." "Yes," said Peter. "But now, look here, Miss Rose. Tell me straight and true. Am I to understand that my position in life makes me unfit to associate with you?" "What nonsense!" she protested, scarlet in the darkness. "What utter stuff!" "I am in retail trade," confessed Peter mournfully, "and lots of people think that awful. Why, even the bookmakers and Jew usurers look down on us. Not that I care a straw." "I should think not." "Except when it comes to your family." "What does it matter about my family, when I—" "Ah, do you? Do you forgive me for being a shopkeeper?" "As if I ever thought of it!" mocked Rose, which was disingenuous of her. "I don't mind what anybody is if he's nice himself. Do you think I'm nice? I am not going to pander to such egregious vanity. Do you think I am a gentleman? Do I pass for one, say, in a house like this? I am not going to answer any more of those horrid, indelicate, unnecessary questions." I see you don't." "I do," she flamed out, indignant with him. "You know I do. Would I, if I didn't?" Her mouth was stopped. In the twinkling of an eye it happened, before either of them knew it. He was carried away, and she was overwhelmed. An earthquake could not have given them a greater shock. "Forgive me," he muttered tremulously, when it was too late. "I know I oughtn't to have, but I couldn't help it. You are not angry?" It was dashed impudence. "But oh, I say, we shall never get such a chance as this again. Could you, do you think, put up with me? Could you? I have loved you ever since that dear morning that you came about Bruce. Could you try to care for me a little bit? I'd give up the business, if you wished, and go into something else. If you mention that blessed business again," laughed Rose hysterically, "I won't speak to you any more." I won't," he promised, a joyful ring in his young voice, "as long as you don't mind, and of course I wouldn't like to disappoint the old pater, and, thank God, there's plenty of money to make you comfortable wherever you like to live. Yes, I know it's awful cheek. I've no business to count chickens like this, but here we are, face to face at last. No one to keep me from speaking to you, and oh, darling, it must be time for the next dance, and I'm engaged for it." "Then go," she urged. "The one after this is ours, and I will wait here for you till you come back. It is only Jim, and he doesn't matter. I must be alone to think, to make up my mind." "You angel!" for he knew what that meant. Off he went, wing-footed, to get through his duty dance as best he could. Rose stayed behind, dodging amongst the bushes to hide her white dress, deaf to Jim's strident calls. And then, presently, the lovers flitted out of the gate, across the boys' cricket ground, and down the bank of one of the 5 creeks, where Rose knew of a nice seat beyond the area of possible disturbance. As they sat down on it together, they leaned inwards, her head drooping to his shoulder, and his arm sliding round her waist in the most natural way in the world. Then silence, packed full. Beyond, in the moonlit waste, curlews wailing sweetly, behind a piano barely audible from the humming house. "What's the matter?" asked Alice Urquhart, when her bedfellow broke out crying suddenly, for no reason that appeared. "Oh, I don't know," cackled Rose. "I am upset with all this. What has upset you? Aha! I saw you and that good-looking young Mr Breen making off into the garden. You've been having a proposal, I suppose?" "Yes," sobbed Rose, between 2 foolish laughs, and forthwith poured out the whole story to her bosom friend. She and Peter had decided not to disclose it to a soul until further consideration, but she was so full that a touch caused her to run over. Miss Urquhart's feelings, when she realised the fact that one of the Pennycuicks was committed to marry a draper, expressed themselves at first in a rather chilling silence. But subsequently, having reviewed the situation from its several sides, and weighed the pros and cons, she decided to assist her friend to make the best of it, as against all the potential enemies. "Of course, they will be as mad as so many March hares," said Alice, referring to the other Pennycuicks. "But after all, when you come to think of it, what is there in a draper's shop any more than in a soft goods warehouse? And that's quite aristocratic, if it's big enough. Trade is trade, and why we should make chalk of one and cheese of another passes me. Oh, you've only got to be rich nowadays to be received anywhere. These Breens seem well off, and anyway, there are the Simpsons. They are all right." "Solid comfort, my dear, is not to be despised, especially when a girl can't pick and choose, and may possibly never get another chance. He is awfully presentable, too, and most gentlemanly, I am sure. Oh, on the whole, if you ask me, I'd say stick to him." Alice's voice was sad, and she sighed inwardly. "I'm going to stick to him," said Rose. "Well, you may count on me. I'll get them all asked here for a picnic, and we'll go over to Bundaboo to invite them, tomorrow. Mrs Simpson said he was only with her for a few days. You darling! And if I were in your place, Rose, I'd marry him just as soon as he wanted me to. I'd walk out and get it done quietly, and tell them afterwards. It would save a lot of unpleasantness, and it wouldn't force the hostile clans to try and make one family when they never could." "I don't see why they couldn't. Mrs. Simpson is his mother's sister." "Oh, well, we shall see. I don't know about Deb and Mary, but France can be all sorts of a cat when the fit takes her, and as she is certain to oppose it to the bitter end, she will never have done irritating his people and setting everybody at loggerheads. However, never mind that now." She enveloped Rose in a comforting embrace. "We'll just enjoy ourselves while we can, and until we must start the fuss with the girls at home, we'll keep things dark, shall we? Just you and I and he. You can tell him when you see him tomorrow that I am his friend." I will, and he will adore you for your goodness." Alice, with still no lover of her own, was pleased with this prospect, and so Rose had a heavenly time for a week or two, Peter extending his visit to match hers, and went home, within a day of him, in good heart for the inevitable struggle. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 17. The starting of the fuss was thus described by the starter in her first letter to her friend. "Oh, my dear, it is simply awful. There is not a scrap of hope. Dear old Deb is the worst, because she cries. Fancy Deb crying! I don't care what Francie says and does, only, if she were not my sister, I would never speak to her again. Even Mary is antagonistic, though I don't believe she would be if it were not for that insufferable husband of hers. He thinks himself, and puts it into her head that we are all going to fall into the bottomless pit if we let trade into the family, as if 9/10 and more of the aristocracy of the country were not traders, and my Peter is as good as her parson any day. But I don't care, except for Deb. I do hate her to have to cry, through me, and to be so kind at the same time. She scolds Francie for being horrid. That does no good, she says, and she is quite right, and then asks me if I have any love left over for her, and all that kind of thing. It makes me feel like a selfish brute, and yet it would not be unselfish to sacrifice Peter. Really, I am quite distracted. I have hardly slept a wink since I came back." Further details followed. "I did not know until I got a letter from him, by the gardener, that Peter came this morning to call, and was not let in. Keziah had been got at, you must know, and works against us. The old liar told him, under instructions of course, that none of us was at home. She that goes to church every Sunday, and pretends to be so pious. Old hypocrite! Well, as I was reading Peter's letter, the doorbell rings, and who should it be but old Daddy Breen coming to demand what we mean by it, snubbing his precious son, whom he thinks good enough for a princess, and so he is. He was not going to be turned from the door, not he. And presently I heard him and Deb at it, hammer and tongs, in the drawing room, and she came up to me afterwards simply in flames. She was wild. My dear, she has left off crying and started to fight. Papa Breen, I am afraid he is a bit bumptious for what she calls his class in life, turned the scale, and now she is as implacable as Francie. She says she will not have the house of Pennycuick disgraced, or words to that effect, while she is alive to prevent it. And when I ask her to be just to Peter, who is no more answerable for his family than I am for mine, and not to judge him off hand before she knows a scrape about him. She simply looks at me as if she itched to box my ears. Isn't it too hard? Other girls have such a lovely time when they are engaged, everybody considering them and giving them opportunities to be together. There's not going to be anything of that sort for us, I can plainly see. Well, I shall not give him up, so they need not think it. I have seen my poor old boy. He was cut up, but feels better now. He asked me to go and see his mother. The moment I walked in and he said, 'Mother, here she is,' the darling opened her arms, and we just hugged as if I was her daughter already. There is nobody like mothers. Papa Breen came home while I was there. I thought he was going to be aggrieved, but he was not with me. If it is not a snobbish thing to say, he is rather proud of his son's choice. He was a bit too fussy and outspoken, and dear Peter got the fidgets, wondering what he would say next, but I did not mind. He talked about building us a house, but Peter whispered to me that that would take too long, and that already he had one in his eye. I know it, a lovely place with the prettiest grounds and stables and coach house and all. Nothing is too good for me. I tried to pacify the girls by telling them that I should have a comfortable home, but they seem to think that the vulgarest feature of the whole affair. It may be, but it's nice. Would you condescend to come and stay with a draper's wife sometimes? We are going to have Bruce to live with us." Then I made Peter come home with me, and I took him in myself to see Deb. He behaved as nicely as possible, but it was no use. "She is of age, Mr Breen," says Deb, with that look of hers. "She will do as she chooses, but she will never do this with my consent, and I feel I never shall." Papa Breen sticks in her throat. If only she had seen Peter before his father came, and not after, but I dare say it would have been the same. They are too eaten up with their prejudices to begin to know him. It is quite hopeless. Here I live in my own home without a friend, and he is treated like a pariah. My poor dear boy! He has been to see me 2 or 3 times, as he has a perfect right to do, and they have just had him shown into the drawing room, and left him to me, neither of them coming near. And this while Bennet Goldsworthy loafs all over the house, as if it was his own, and presumes to look at me in a superior sort of way, as if I was one of his dirty little Sunday school children in disgrace. They bring him up into the attic even, our own private room, mine as much as theirs. They never did it before, and it is only because he is banded with them against me. Well, I wouldn't marry Bennet Goldsworthy if there was not another man in the world. I have my ring, such diamonds, too valuable, I tell Peter, but he says nothing can be that, and I know they can't help seeing it, because the whole room flashes when I turn it this way and that, like blue lightning playing, but they all pretend not to, since they find they cannot break our engagement. The idea is to ignore it as if it was something so low as to be beneath their notice. Perhaps they fancy that will wear me out, but it won't. If they had been nice, and pleaded with me, and if Peter had not been so very dear and good, I might have caved in, but not now. And, indeed, I am sure I never should anyway, only we might have agreed to differ without quarrelling, which we never did before. Oh, it is too miserable. Poor Mr and Mrs Breen must hate the very name of Pennycuick, and they will end by hating me if this goes on. Peter has bought the house, and is asking me to hurry our marriage, to get me out of it. He says a private ceremony would not be dishonourable under the circumstances. It seems to me a mean sort of way to go to him, but what do you think? My dear, wrote Alice Urquhart, I think Peter is right. Next time he asks you, you say yes. It will be a real kindness to both families, who would never know what to do with a house wedding. Besides, then you might have to be given away by BG. Walk out quietly and unbeknown, and don't come back. Right from the Blue Mountains or somewhere. Yours ever, Rose Breen. And later on, when things have settled down, their hearts will melt, and they will come and see you. Let me know what day, and I will run down to the dentist to see fair play and sign the register. Now, you need not have any scruples, child, because the whole of your husband's family approve of the match. Simpson's delighted, if a little huffy for the moment to see solid worth looked down upon, and Deb and the others are certain to come round when they find it is no use doing anything else. Outsiders don't matter, and I should hate touting for wedding presents in such a mixed concern. As for your clothes, you have plenty. When you want more, you can get them cost price at the shop. It is a very good shop, I hear, and I mean to be a steady customer from this out. Oh, yes, and I will come and see you, old girl, nows and then, when I have to go to town. And you and Peter must spend all your Christmases up here, while he is seeing his people at Bundaboo. You can camp with me, like old times. At the last moment Rose broke down, and wept upon the breast of her favourite sister, in the act of bidding her good-bye, perhaps because Frances chanced to be absent at the time. Oh, Debbie darling, I won't deceive you. I am not going shopping. I am going into Melbourne to get married quietly, and have done with it, so as not to be a nuisance to you any more. Married! Gasped Deb, holding the agitated creature at arm's length. What, now? And you spring this on us without a word of warning? What was the use, Deb? You know what you would have said. I have got to have him, dear, I really have, and this seemed the only way. Where is he? Waiting till I'm ready. They have a carriage outside. His mother and sister are going with us. His father will join us when we get there. And Alice Urquhart, who is in town, and one of his cousins from Bundaboo. Quite respectable and above board, you see, only very quiet, so as not to trouble you and the girls and poor dear Bennet Goldsworthy more than we can help." "Not trouble us?" broke in Deb, her face, that had paled a moment ago, flaming scarlet. "Rose, in your wildest aberrations, I did not credit you with being capable of humiliating us to this extent." "Ay, you always say that. If you only knew him. But some day you will. And then you will wonder how you could have set yourself against us so. I can't help it, Deb. I did it for the best. Marry him I must and will. And I am only trying to do it in a way as inoffensive to you as possible." "You call this an inoffensive way? But those people cannot be expected to know." "They can. They do. Don't insult them any more. They are giving me everything they can think of to make me happy. And here I have no home, no love, no sympathy from anybody." Tears gushed from her eyes, and Deb's as from the same spring. They were instantly locked in each other's arms. "Poor little Rosie! Poor dear child! But you don't understand, pet. You don't know what you are doing, going right out of your class, out of your world." "But to a good husband, Debbie, and the man I love, and that's first of all. And I must go to him now. I must not keep him waiting. Bless you, dearest. I am happy now. Never mind the others. You can tell them after I'm gone. But I felt that I must speak to you before I went. Oh, I am so glad I did. Good bye, darling. I must go." "You must not go," said Deb, swallowing her tears and resuming her imperious air. "Not this way, Rose, as if your family had cast you off. How can you treat us so, child? And perhaps we deserve it, only you don't see what you are doing as clearly as we do." Deb, don't stop me. They are waiting. It is late now." The bride-elect, pale and fright, struggled in her sister's strong hands, which held her fast. "Where is Mr Breen?" demanded Deb. "Waiting at his house. Waiting for me. I must send for him." "Oh, Deb, not now, when everything is settled, and they have had all the expense and trouble. Will you fetch him, Rose, if I let you go? For 1 minute only." "No, I won't stop it. I can't, of course, but I must go with you." "Rose, I must." "Oh, Debbie, would you? Oh, how I wish I had known before. Yes, I'll run and bring him. We must drive faster, that's all." "Oh, Deb, how happy this will make us! But " "Run away and fetch him. Ask him, with my compliments, if he will be so good, and I will get my hat on while you are gone." How she managed it was a mystery, but by the time the bridegroom appeared, Deb was in her best walking costume, hatted and veiled, with a pair of new pale coloured gloves in her hand. "Mr Breen," said she, grave and stately, "I am going to ask a favour of you. Allow me to take my sister to the church and give her away." Peter was naturally flurried, besides being a trifle overawed. He mumbled something to the effect that he was sure his family would be quite agreeable, and that his sister would give up her place in the carriage and go by train. And Deb, facing him with the air of a duchess, thought how thoroughly shoppy his manner was. His splendid new clothes helped to give her that impression. Fine dressing was one of the Breens' trifling errors of taste as drapers, which damned them in her eyes. But what would she have thought if he had not done all honour to his bride in this respect? "We will go by train," said she decisively. "I have already delayed you a little, and you must be there first. The train will be quicker than driving, so that we shall be quite in time." She smiled as she caught his swift glance of alarm at Rose. "No, I am not going to kidnap her. I only wish to observe the proprieties a little, for her sake." "If the proprieties have not been observed," retorted Peter, suddenly bold, "it has not been all my fault, Miss Pennycuick." "Perhaps not," she said gently, for she was a generous woman. "Perhaps not. At any rate," holding out her hand, "we must let bygones be bygones now. Be good to her, that is all I ask." Peter seized her hand in his superfine glove, and wrung it emotionally, while Rose embraced her sister's left arm and kissed her sleeve. Then, after a hurried consultation of timetables, the bridegroom retired, and was presently seen to clatter past the house in the bridal carriage, which had white horses to it, to Deb's disgust. She and Rose talked little on their journey. Rose was questioned about clothes and pocket money, and asked whether she had a safe pocket anywhere. On Rose answering that she had, Deb pressed into it a closed envelope, which she charged her sister not to open until away on her honeymoon. Rose disobeyed the order, and found a hastily scrawled cheque for £100, money which she knew could ill be spared. "Oh, you darling!" she murmured fondly. "But I won't take it, Deb, I won't. It would leave you poor for years, while I shall have heaps of everything." "If you don't," broke in Deb, tragically stern and determined, "if you don't take it and buy your first clothes with it, I will never forgive you as long as I live. Child, don't you see?" Rose saw this much. Deb's horror of the thought of being beholden to the Breens for a post-nuptial trousseau. Reluctantly she pocketed the gift. "But I shall never want it, you know." "I don't care about that," said Deb. The bridegroom's relief of mind when he saw the bride coming was so great as to do away with all the usual embarrassment of a man so circumstanced. "Ha! Now we are all right," he said to Harry Simpson, cousin and best man, and forthwith acted as if the trouble were over instead of just beginning. There was nothing shoppy in his demeanour now, even to Deb's prejudiced eye. The sisters walked up the nave to the altar, hand in hand. Deb passed the bridesmaid, Alice Urquhart, without a look. Her people had brought the young pair together, and were answerable for these consequences, and similarly ignored those walking fashion plates, Mrs and Miss Breen. She landed her charge at the appointed hassock, and quietly facing the clergyman, stood still and dry-eyed amid the usual tearful flutter, apparently the calmest of the party. But poor Deb suffered pangs unspeakable, and her excessive dignity was maintained only by the sternest effort. In the vestry, after the ceremony, she was introduced by the bride to her new relations, and Papa Breen, with a great show of magnanimity, expressed his satisfaction at seeing Miss Pennycuick on this suspicious occasion, and formally invited her to what he called a little snack at Menzies, where a gorgeous wedding breakfast had been prepared at his orders. "Thank you very much, Mr Breen," she said affably. "It would have given me great pleasure, but if you will excuse me, I must run home to my other sisters, whom I left in ignorance of this event, which concerns them so nearly." "Oh, Deb, do come," pleaded the bride. No, the line had to be drawn somewhere. Deb was very kind, very polite, very plausible with her excuses, but to Menzies with those people and their white horse carriage she would not go. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 18. Rose had never been reckoned a person of importance by her family, but now that she was gone, there remained a terrible emptiness where she had been. She was one of those unselfish, good-natured members of households to whom falls the stocking mending, the errand going, the fetching and carrying, the filling of gaps generally, and at every turn Deb and Frances missed her unobtrusive ministrations, which they had accepted as much matters of course as the attentions of the butcher and baker. It was presently perceived that Keziah missed her too, that Keziah, who had loyally opposed the plebeian marriage, was becoming a turncoat and renegade, blessing where she should have cursed, blaming where she should have praised, yes, blaming even Queen Deborah, who, needless to say, took her head off for it. It had been Keziah's own choice to follow the sisters into exile, and to share the privations involved in their change of life. She had given up her Redford luxuries and importance to become a general servant, with only her kitchen to sit in, for their sakes, and she had cheerfully abided by her choice until Rose went. Rose was the one who had understood the cost of the sacrifice, and who had lighted it by sympathetic companionship. They had cleaned rooms, and made cakes and puddings, and set hens, and stirred jam, and ironed frocks and laces together. They had spent hours in pleasant gossip over the many homely subjects that interested both. Their relation had been more that of a mother and daughter than of servant and mistress. Regarding her as virtually her child, Keziah had been quick to spring to the side of authority in the matter of the irregular love affair. The natural parental impulse was to nip it in the bud, but Providence had decided the issue in this case, and a flirtatious girl was one thing, and a respectable married woman another. And Keziah was lonely, and felt neglected and put upon, when nobody came to talk to her in her kitchen, or to help her with her cooking and ironing, and particularly after she had told Deb that it was a shame to bear malice to Miss Rose now, and Deb had commanded her to mind her own business. She was suspected of treacherous visits to the house next door. She was known to have spent Sunday afternoons with Mrs. Peter herself. The iniquity of these proceedings was in secrecy she observed, or tried to observe, regarding them. It was she who knew, before anybody else, when a baby Breen was coming, and if a married woman was a personage to Keziah, an incipient mother was being of the highest rank. She had forgiven Mary everything for the sake of her black-eyed boy. Now she took the news that Rose was what she called interesting to Deb, and demanded that action should be taken upon it, with an air that was almost truculent. Deb, of course, did not believe in being spoken to, even by Keziah, in that way. "Has the muffin boy been?" she inquired, with a steady look. "It's too soon yet, and I can tell you, Miss Deb, that if it was you in her place, she wouldn't keep it up like this, and at such a time too. When the muffin boy comes, Keziah, please pay him the sixpence we owe him from last week. You will find the money on my writing table." "Well, I don't care. I call it a shame not to go to her." "Perhaps you would like to go to her yourself." Deb swiftly changed her tone. "I'd like nothing better," the old woman retorted, with spirit, "if you are agreeable." "I am perfectly agreeable." "Well, it was only the other day she said she'd give anything to have me, if it wasn't for taking me away from you." "Oh, pray don't consider that. I can easily get somebody else," said Deb affably, though her surprise at the idea of Keziah wanting to leave her was only equalled by her dismay. Keziah, already surprised to find herself of so much less consequence than she had supposed, said that, if that was the case, she'd go and see Miss Rose about it. "You can go now," said Deb. "Thank you, Miss Deb, I will," said Keziah, "as soon as I have cleared up. Would a month's notice suit you? I don't wish to put you about at all." "A month will be ample," said Deb. "A week, if you like." "I'll see what Miss Rose says," said Keziah. Rose, after the interview, wrote affectionately to Deb, to say she would not dream of taking Keziah if Deb wanted her. Deb wrote affectionately to Rose, to say that she would be rather glad than otherwise to make the change, as the work was too much for such an old woman. So Keziah went over to the Breen camp, where she had comfort and companionship, and her own way in everything, and Deb began to experiment with the common or garden general, as purveyed by Melbourne registry offices. She loathed these creatures, one and all. They were of a race unknown at Redford, and she was singularly unlucky in the specimens that fell to her, although some of them could have been made something of by a mistress who knew how to do it. It is only fair to state that they loathed her, for a finicking, unreasonable, stuck-up poor woman, who gave herself the airs of a wealthy lady. They came at the rate of 2 a month, and each one as she passed seemed to leave the little house meaner, dingier, more damaged than before. It was not living, it was pigging, Frances said, and Deb agreed with her, although when Keziah ventured to call one day to inquire into the state of things, Deb calmly asserted that all was well. In despair she tried a lady help, in the person of Miss Keene, dying to return to her dear family, from relations who did not want her, on any terms. "Whatever we ask her to do we must do ourselves," said Deb to grumbling Frances, who seemed never willing to do anything. "And of course we shall have to get a washwoman and a charwoman to scrub, but it will be cheaper in the end. And oh, anything rather than sticky door handles and greasy spoons, and those awful voices hailing one and all over the house." But it was not cheaper, nor was the arrangement satisfactory in any way after the first fortnight. Miss Keene, spoiled at Redford as they had been, was as unfit for crude housework, and she aggravated her incompetence by weeping over it. She had not gathered from Deb's letters that the change in the family fortunes was as great as it is now proved to be, and Deb had not anticipated the effect of adversity upon one so easily depressed. She had no heart, poor thing. She struggled and muddled, sighing for flowers for the vases while the beds were unmade, and when she saw a certain look on Deb's face, wept and mourned and gave up hope. So they pigged still, although they did not defile the furniture with unwashed hands, and the plate and crockery with greasy dishcloths. With no knowledge of cookery, they lived too much on tinned provisions, a diet as wasteful as it was unwholesome, feeding their wash and scrub women with the same, and their efforts to support the burden of their domestic responsibilities deprived them of outdoor exercise and mental rest and recreation, kept them at too close quarters with one another, each rubbing her quivering prickles upon the irritable skins of the other two. Frances bore the strain with least good nature and self control, and since she had to vent her ill humour on someone, naturally made Miss Keene her victim when it was a choice between her and Deb. The poor lady grew more and more disappointed, discouraged and tearful. She became subject to indigestion, headaches, disordered nerves, finally fell ill and had to have the doctor. The doctor said she was completely run down, and that rest and change of air were indispensable. She went away to her relatives, weeping still, wrapped in Deb's cloak, and with all Deb's ready money in her pocket, and she did not come back. Then Deb tried to carry on alone. Any sort of registry office drudge would have been welcome now, but had become an expense that she dared not continue. Moreover, the spectre of poverty, looming so distinct and unmistakable in the house, was a thing to hide, if possible, from anybody who could go outside and talk about it. The thing had become a living terror to herself, its claws due moneylenders, so velvety and innocent when her wilful ignorance made first acquaintance with them. But nobody, not even Mr Thornycroft, not even Jim, certainly not Rose, could be allowed to play Perseus to this proud Andromeda, until she could free herself. They were not even to know that she was bound. Of course, she need not have been bound. It was her own fault. She should have managed better with the resources at her disposal than to bring herself to such a pass. And that so soon. Either Mary or Rose would certainly have done so in her place. But nature had not made her or Frances, whose rapacities had been one cause of the financial breakdown, for the role of domestic economists. They had been dowered with their lovely faces for other purposes. That the fine plumage is for the sun was a fact well understood by Frances, at any rate, and she was wild at the wrongs wrought by sordid circumstances. Her father's and sister's heedlessness upon herself. She thought only of herself. Deb was getting old, and she deserved to suffer anyway, But what had Frances done to be deprived of her birthright, of all her chances of success in life? 18, and no coming out, beautiful, and nobody to see it, marriageable, and out of the track of all the eligible men, amongst whom she might have had her pick and choice. She had reason for her passionate rebelliousness against this state of things, for, while a pretty face is theoretically its own fortune anywhere, we all see for ourselves how many are passed over simply for want of an attractive setting. It was quite on the cards that she might share the fate of those beauties in humble life to whom romantic accidents do not occur. For all her golden hair and aristocratic profile, her figure of a sylph and complexion of a wild rose, the fear of this future combined with the acute discomfort of the present to make her desperate. She cast about for a way of escape, a pathway to the sun. One only offered the landlord. He was an elderly landlord, who had lately buried a frumpy old wife, and he was as deeply tainted with trade as Peter Breen. But he had retired long since from personal connection with breweries and public houses, and a brewer, in the social scale, was only just below a wholesale importer, if that, and he was manifestly rolling in money after the manner of his kind. Half the streets around belonged to him, and his house towered up in the midst of his other houses, a great white block with a pillared portico, a young palace by comparison. Above all, he had no known children. From the first he had taken an interest in his pretty girl tenants. He had liked to call in person to inquire if the cellar kept dry and the chimney had ceased smoking, and he had been most generous in offering improvements and repairs before they were even asked for. Deb had blighted these unbusinesslike overtures on her own account, and Frances herself had said the rudest things about them and him, but not lately. In the utter dullness and barrenness of her life, she had been glad to accept the civilities of anything in the shape of a man, to try her prentice hand on any material. All the armoury of the born beauty was hers, and she knew as well how to use each weapon effectively as a blind kitten knows how to suck milk. They were easily successful with the old fool, who is ever more of a fool than the young fool, and when she found that, she found something to entertain her. She not only received Mr Ewing when he called, but talked to him at the gate when he went past, and he went past several times a day. Now when the situation at home had grown desperate, and she was looking all ways for means to save herself, his amusing infatuation became a matter for serious thought. Could she? She was a hard case, but even she wavered. He was probably 60, and she was 18. Oh, she couldn't. But when, after Miss Keene's departure, Deb told her they could no longer afford hired help, and that she, Frances, must give up her lazy ways and take her share of that intolerable housework, then Frances changed her mind. Beggars could not be choosers. Deb felt like the camel under the last straw when the announcement of the proposed marriage was made to her. It was worse than Mary's, worse than Rose's, worse than any other misfortune that had befallen the family. She sat down and wept at the thought of what the Pennycuicks had come to. She rated Frances furiously. She reasoned with her, she pleaded with her, she tried to bribe her. But Frances was getting boxes of diamonds, and sets of furs and lace, and what not, and it was useless for Deb to attempt to outbid the giver of these things, or to part her sister from them. She loved the old man, Frances said. He certainly was a decently mannered, good-natured, rather fine-looking, and most generous old man, and he was going to take her everywhere and give her a good time, and she would never have to go shabby again as long as she lived. And if Deb refused her a proper wedding, law or no law, she would run away with him, as Mary had run away with Bennet Goldsworthy, and Rose with Peter Breen. Whether this dire threat prevailed, or the temptation of the money, or whether she could not any longer fight against fate, Deb gave in. After all, Frances was not to be judged as an ordinary girl. She was a hard-hearted, tough-fibred, prosaic little minx, for which reason Deb pitied the prospective husband more than she did her, and if she did not do this bad thing now, the chances were that she would do a worse thing later on. She was made to disport herself in the sunshine of the world. She was of the type of woman that must have men about her. She would get her rights, as she called them, somehow, by fair means or foul. Deb was sufficiently a woman of the world herself to recognise this, and the uselessness of thinking she could alter it. Well, money is a consolatory thing. She knew its value now, and there was that additional comfort, which, of course, she did not own to, the thought of where Mr Ewing would be when Mrs Ewing was in her prime. "You dear old thing," the bride-elect patronised her elder sister. "James is so pleased to have your consent, and he says he won't ask you to give me my share of what father left us. It would be but a drop in the bucket anyway. You are to keep it all yourself." Deb had had whole control of the fragments of his once large fortune left by Mr Pennycuick to his 4 daughters, on behalf of any of them unmarried or under age. But Mary and Rose, although Peter had also protested against it, had been paid the value of their shares, whence the due element in the present difficulties. And the unforeseen marriage of Frances at 18 threatened total bankruptcy to the remaining sister. Yet Deb said, with fierce determination, "Of course you will have what is your due, like the others." "I'm sure he won't take it, Deb. He said he wouldn't." "I don't care what he says. It concerns you and me, not him." "I really should not miss it, dear. I am to have 1,000 a year to draw against, for just nothing but my clothes and pocket money." "I am glad to hear it," said Deb. "You can give your own income to the poor." "You really won't keep it?" "Is it likely I would keep what doesn't belong to me?" "Well, then," said Frances, her easy conscience satisfied, "we can put it into my trousseau. I must have a decent trousseau, mustn't I?" "Of course." Frances saw to it that she had a decent one. Now was the time, the only time, that she would want her money, and she did not spare it. She ordered right and left, and Deb seemed equally reckless. The bills were left for her to settle, of course made out in her name. Mr Ewing pressed for permission to pay them, and the cost of the wedding, and Miss Pennycuick could hardly forgive him the deadly insult. He also desired that she should occupy her villa rent-free, and she gave him notice on the spot. "I shall not continue to keep house when I am alone," said she grandly. "I intend to travel for a time." The wedding was quiet, but as decent as the trousseau. The other sisters were invited, and Bennet Goldsworthy, who delighted in the connection, and received a thumping fee, performed the ceremony. Deb gave the bride away, but was also treated as the bridesmaid, and had a diamond bracelet forced upon her. She sold it as soon as the donor's back was turned, together with every article of jewellery in her possession, every bit of silver plate, and all her furniture. The breakfast was very elegant, and served in a private room at one of the best hotels. The bride's handsome luggage had also been brought thither, and it was the meeting place of the family, which so seldom met. There also, when she had parted from Frances, Deb parted from Mary, so silent and constrained, and from Rose, overdressed for her station in her rich gown and Brussels lace, but nevertheless sniffed at the condescending to buy her still more wealthy sister, and from the uncongenial brothers-in-law to whom she was so discouragingly polite. Their expressed anxiety to befriend and to see more of her was gently but firmly ignored. "I will write," she said. "I will see you again soon. I will let you know my plans. Good bye." And they went. There were no friends to go, for she had insisted on inviting none, for fear of the lynx eyes and the destructive influence upon her plans of Mr Thornycroft and Jim. She gained the one end she had schemed for throughout, to get past the risks of the public marriage and back to a struggle in obscurity, unmolested, unpitied, unshamed. The Urquharts wrote, and Mr Thornycroft, when he sent his present, but she had bluffed them with her implied misrepresentations, and hurt their feelings by not wanting them at the wedding. Jim was easily snubbed. Mr Thornycroft, though he did not mention it, was ill at the time. So she got rid of all possible hindrances, and then, professing to go travelling, went nobody knew where, and was virtually lost for years. Frances drove away from the hotel in her smart carriage, with her smart luggage and smart maid, and her amorous old husband, and never thought or cared what was to become of her abandoned sister. She could only think of her own exciting affairs. Partly they were unsatisfactory, no doubt. All her rights were not hers even now, no, not by a long way. But oh, how much better was this than the drab and shabby and barren existence for ever left behind. She was bound, indeed, yet she was free, freer than another might have been in her place, and far, far less bound. One must expect to pay some tax to fortune for such extraordinary gifts, and Frances was not the one to pay it in heart's blood. She was philosophically prepared to pay it in her own coin, and be done with it, and then give herself to the enjoyment of the pleasures of her lot. Her first enjoyment was in her beautiful going away dress, grey cloth and chinchilla fur, with flushes of pink as delicate as the rose of her cheeks, and in her knowledge of the effect she made in that dream of a costume. There was no hiding her light under a bushel any more. The highway, and the middle of it, for her now, her proud husband strutting there beside her, and every passer-by turning to look at and to admire her. There was joy in the occupancy of the best suite of rooms in the best hotel at every place she stopped at during her gay and well-filled bridal holiday; joy in the dainty meals, so long unknown, in the obsequious servants, in the plentiful theatres, in the ever-ready carriage that took her to them, in the having one's hair done to perfection by an expert maid, in sweeping forth with one's silks and laces trailing, and one's diamonds on. These were the delights for which her little soul had so long yearned. She now pursued them greedily. She could not rest if she were not doing something to display herself and feed her craving for what is known as seeing the world. Her husband was almost as obsequious as the servants, doubtless because from the first she took the beauty's high hand with him, as well as the attitude of the superior, naturally assumed by youth towards age, and he enjoyed the sensation she made almost as much as she did. Visibly he swelled and preened himself when his venerable contemporaries cast the eye of surprise, not to say of envy, upon the conjunction of his complacent figure and that of the bride who might have been his granddaughter. He toiled for that pleasure, and to make pleasure for her, as no old gentleman should toil. He gave her everything she asked for, including his own ease and consequence, his own vital health and strength. But the honeymoon waned, and the novelty wore off, and prudence and old habits resumed their sway. He grew tired of incessant gadding about, alarmed at his symptoms of physical overstrain, weary for his armchair and his club, and his men friends and his masculine occupations. She, on the other hand, insatiable for admiration and excitement still, was weary of his constant company. It became the killjoy of her festive days, growing from a necessary bore to an intolerable irritation as the dimensions of her little court of younger gallants enlarged about her. Therefore she had no objection to his halting on the toilsome path, so long as he allowed her to go on alone. It was not a case of allowing, however. He might object, and did, but he was no match for her either in diplomacy or in fight, and her cajoleries were usually sufficient for her ends, without calling out the reserves behind them. In any contest between selfishness and unselfishness, the result is a foregone conclusion. So she began to go about with miscellaneous escorts, to play the combined parts of frisky matron and society beauty, an intoxicating experience, while the supporter of that proud position played the humble role of chief comer stone, unseen and unconsidered in the basement of the fabric. He attended to his investments and increasing infirmities, and made secret visits to a married daughter, wife of a big hotel keeper, who hated her young stepmother, and whose existence Frances ignored. One day Guthrie Carey, after several voyages to other ports, appeared again in Melbourne. He had just landed, and was strolling along Collins Street, when he encountered a vision of loveliness that almost took away his breath. "What? It is not Miss Frances, surely?" "It is not," smiled she, all her beauty at its conscious best as she recognised his, which was that of a man of men, splendid in his strong prime. And she told him who she was, and a few other things, as they stood on the pavement, she so graceful in her mature self-possession, he staring at her, stupidly distraught, like a bewildered schoolboy. "I had no idea," he mumbled. "That I was married? Alas, yes," with a sad shake of the head. "We girls are fated, I think." "Miss Deb?" "Oh, not Deb. She has escaped so far." "Is she well?" "I have not seen her lately, but I am sure she is. She always is. She is not in Melbourne?" "No, I don't quite know where she is. She has got a wandering fit on. Come and have some lunch with me, and I'll tell you all the news." They turned into a restaurant, and had a meal which took a long time to get through. In the middle of the afternoon they parted, on the understanding that he would dine with her later in her own house. At the end of the few days that were virtually filled with him, Mrs Ewing sat down in her fine boudoir to weep over her hard fate. Oh, why wasn't he the one to have the money? Oh, why do we meet again, now that it is too late? At the end of a few more days she went to her old husband to ask him how he was. He said he was a bit troubled with his lumbago, but otherwise fairly well. "What you want," said she, "is a sea voyage." He thought not. He had never found the sea suit him, and travelling was a great fatigue, and it was the wrong time of year for it, anyhow. They had a good home, and it was the best place. But she knew better. She had made up her mind, and it was useless for him to rebel. The sea voyage was decided on, not so much because it would benefit his health as because his young wife had not seen England and Europe, and was dying to do so. Then they discussed routes. "The thing to do," said Mrs. Ewing, "is not to crowd up with that lot in the mail steamers, where you can't do as you like, or have any special attentions, but to go in a smaller vessel, where you would be of some importance, and have your liberty, and plenty of space, and no tiresome rules and restrictions." "My dear child, you don't know those second-rate lines. I do. I assure you you'd be very sorry for yourself if I let you travel by them. They are not your style at all." "Yes, I was talking to Captain Carey about it, and that was his advice, and he knows. On his ship they have accommodation for about 6 passengers, and he suggested that, if we were quick about it, we might be able to secure the whole, so as to be exactly as if we were on a yacht of our own. They have a fair cook, but we could take any servants we liked, and make ourselves comfortable in our own way. Nobody to interfere with us. He doesn't go through the hot canal. He will be back from Sydney in 3 weeks. Just nice time to get ready in." Of course, they went that way, and perhaps it is better to leave the rest of the story to the imagination of the reader, who, one hopes, for Guthrie Carey's sake, is a common-sense person, as well as a dispassionate student of human nature. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 19. Deb was at Redford once more, in her own room too, surrounded by familiar objects. The 6-foot dressing table and the 9-foot wardrobe, and the Aspinall bookcase that was a fixture, amongst other things. She had not taken them to her suburban villa, nor sent for them afterwards. Meanwhile, Mr. Thornycroft had bought them with the place, and taken care of them, as of everything that she had left behind. They had been in his possession now for several years. The strange thing in the room was Mr. Thornycroft himself. Mr. Thornycroft on the little white bed that Deb used to sleep on, his hair white, his once stalwart frame reduced to a pale wreck of skin and bone. "You will forgive me for coming here," he apologised. "I have not been using the things, but they had me moved for coolness, the southeast aspect, and being able to get a current through. I am thankful they did. It is the best place for you this weather. But there's one thing I shall never forgive you, that you didn't let me know before." She was sitting at his bedside, holding his hand. She, too, much changed, thinner, sadder, shabbier, or rather, less splendidly turned out than had been her wont in earlier days, beautiful as ever, notwithstanding, infinitely more so, in the sick man's eyes. "Why should I bother you? I haven't been very bad, just old asthma off and on. It is only lately that I have felt it upsetting my heart, and you know I am used to being alone." He spoke with the asthma pant, and a throb of the lean throat that she could not bear to see. His head was propped high, so that they squarely faced each other. His eyes were full of tenderness and content, hers of tears. "You have been pretty lonely yourself, by all accounts," said he, stroking her hand. "It's odd to think of you in that case, Debbie." "I've felt it odd myself," she smiled, with a whisk of her handkerchief. "But, like you, I am getting used to it." "Where's Dalzell all this time?" "Don't know. Don't care. Please don't talk of him." "Nobody else?" "Oh dear, no. Never will be. I am going to take up nursing or something." "You?" he mocked. "Do you suppose I can't? Wait till I have got you over this attack, and then tell me if I can't. I am going to stay with you, godpa, until you are better. I have spoken to your housekeeper, and she is quite agreeable, if you are." He did not think it necessary to reply to that hint, but just smiled and closed his eyes. She took up a palm leaf fan and fanned him, watching him anxiously. It was a roasting February day, and he was breathing very badly. "Have you given up your house?" he asked, when he could speak. "Long ago. No use my staying there alone. Besides, I could not afford it." "Francie not much good to you, I suppose?" "Oh, I don't want her to be good to me." "Keziah Moon hasn't deserted you, of course?" "Oh, Keziah! She was moped to death, poor old woman. I found her a nuisance. And then those babies of Rose's were so irresistible. I thought she'd better go, as Rose's head nurse. I believe she is in her element." "Is Rose happy with her draper?" "I don't know. I suppose so. You don't see much of her?" "Not much." "And Mary?" "I haven't seen her for months. Her husband and I don't hit it off somehow." "Deb, how much have you to live on?" "That's my business, sir." Not the business of a doting godfather, in the absence of nearer male relative. "No, his business is only to see that I learn the catechism and present myself to be confirmed, and I've done both." "That all?" "Except to let his doting godchild take care of him when he is ill. Now, don't talk any more." He was too exhausted to do so, and while he lay feebly fighting for breath, the trained nurse came in and took command. In the evening that functionary gave a professional opinion. "He is worried about something," she said to Deb, "and it is very bad for him. Do you know what it is?" "Not in the least," said Deb promptly. "I have not been seeing him for years, I am sorry to say, and have not the slightest knowledge of his affairs." But the next day she seemed to get an inkling of what the worrying was. Mr Thornycroft, when they were alone together, begged her to tell him if she had any money difficulties debts, she supposed, and to be frank with him for old times, and her father's sake. "What, are you bothering your mind about that?" she gently scolded him. "I assure you I am all right. I haven't any difficulties, or hardly any, not now. I have no rent, you see." "They don't charge you anything where you board?" "No, Redford never has charged folks for board. Seriously," she hastened to add, in earnest tones, "I have all I want, and if I try presently to earn more, it will be because I think everybody ought to earn his living or hers." "You earned yours. I despise people who just batten on the earnings of others, and never do a hand's turn for themselves." "Batten," he murmured ironically, with a troubled smile. "You look as if you had been battening, don't you, Debbie? I'm a business man, and I know you can't get behindhand in money matters and pull up again just when you want to. You can't get straight merely by anticipating income, when there's nothing extra coming in. Tell me, if you don't mind, how you managed." She flushed, and her eyes dropped. Then she faced him honestly. "I will tell you," she declared. "I've wanted to confess it, though I'm horribly ashamed to, and I'm afraid you'll think I did not value it. I did indeed. I hated to part with it, but I was so hard up, and I didn't know which way to turn, or what else to do." "And never came to me?" "Well, I did, in a way. I sold your pearls." "That's right, Debbie. That's a load off my mind. It is the best thing you could have done with them." "No, indeed. I have regretted it ever since." "How much did they give you?" "A tremendous lot. 350 guineas." The swindlers! They were worth 2,000. "What?" She was thunderstruck. "You gave me a necklace worth 2,000 guineas?" "I only wish you'd let me give you a score or two at the same price, on condition that you sold them for 350 whenever you needed a little cash." She was quite upset by this remark, and what had given rise to it. Impulsively, too impulsively, considering how weak he was, she kissed his damp forehead, and rushed weeping from his sight. In the hot evening, while the trained nurse had her tea at grateful leisure in the housekeeper's room, Deb again took the nurse's place. She sat by the pillow of the patient, leaning against it, holding his hand in hers. Only the sound of the cruel north wind and his more cruel breathing disturbed the stillness that enveloped them. She hoped he was sleeping, until he spoke suddenly in a way that showed him only too wide awake. "Debbie," he said, "if I was quite sure I would not get well this time, I should put the question to you again." "What question, dear?" she queried softly. "The question I asked you just before you left Redford." "I don't remember." "Oh!" "Yes, that one. But if you consented, I might recover. It would be enough to make me. Then you would repent." She was silent, agitated in every fibre of her, but thinking hard. "What put that idea into your head?" she whispered, still holding his hand. "It was never put in. It was there always, since you were a kiddie." "It seems so strange. I thought I was always a kiddie to you. That does seem the natural relationship, doesn't it?" There fell another long silence, and, listening to his dragging breath, her heart smote her. She squeezed his bony hand. "I will stay with you, anyway," she comforted him. He turned his head on the pillow. "Kiss me," he sighed, with eyes closed. She did, again and again. The night was suffocating. She could not sleep for the heat and her thoughts, and when, towards morning, she heard the nurse stirring, she got up to inquire how he was. "Pretty bad," the nurse said. "It's this awful weather. I can't cool the room, though I've got all the doors and windows open, and the wet sheets hanging up. It's air he wants, and there isn't any. If it don't change soon, I'm afraid his strength won't hold out." It did not change, and consequently grew worse to bear, the parching and scorching of each day being carried over into the next. What the newspapers call a heat wave was drawing to its culmination, which generally reaches the verge of the unbearable, even to the well and strong, just before the change, that lightning change to coolness, and even coldness, which comes while one draws a breath. How many a life has hung upon the chance of the blessed moment coming in time! The nurse looked at the thermometer in despair. Darkness had not taken 10 degrees from yesterday's temperature of 102 degrees when another blazing sun arose. The fierce wind had raved and calmed, and raved and calmed, but it had not shifted. She wetted and she fanned, turn and turn about with Deb the lifelong day, without freshening the dead air that soaked the house and seemed to soak the world. The fagged and perspiring doctor, a great friend of the patient's, who came twice daily, came again, too tired to care very much even for this special case. He looked at it, and shook his head, and begged for a cool drink for the Lord's sake, and then, having muddled the wits he had tried to stimulate with quarts of whisky and soda, went away, saying, "I can do nothing. Send for me at once if you see a change." At sunset the sick man was very low, his weak heart and his distressed lungs labouring heavily, while the sweat of agony glistened on his forehead and plastered his white hair to his backward tossed head. Deb was frantic with fear and grief. She summoned the doctor again, sending commands to him to summon more doctors, the best in Melbourne, and any number of them, in defiance of Mr Thornycroft's known wishes to the contrary. At the same time she went for the clergyman. "Dear," she crooned in the patient's ear, when he seemed a little easier, "Mr Bentley will be here presently." Mr Thornycroft's brows seemed to gather a momentary frown over his closed eyes. "I'd rather not, Deb." "Oh, not for that. But the wind will change soon, and then you will feel better. And then, you said it would help you to get well. I will, if you like." He opened his eyes and gazed at her. It took him a few seconds to understand. "Oh, darling," he breathed between his pants, and with an effort drew her hand to his lips. Then they were his last words, whispered very low. "Never mind now, Debbie, so long as you are here." He seemed to drowse into a kind of half sleep, in spite of his too obvious and audible suffering. She sat beside him, sponging and fanning him, listening to his shallow, jerky, wheezy respiration, watching for the subtle something in the stifling room that should announce a change of wind, thinking of Mr Bentley's coming, and many other things. The weary nurse came back from her brief rest and cup of tea, and sat down at the foot of the bed. She studied the patient's face intently for some time, and felt his feet. Then she took the fan from Deborah's hand. "You go and lie down, Miss Pennycuick. Mrs Dobson will come and sit with me for a while." "No, no," said Deb. "He wants me to be here. I cannot leave him." After a few more minutes of silence, the nurse said again, "You had better go, Miss Pennycuick." When Deb repeated her refusal, the nurse went out to fetch the housekeeper to persuade her. A minute afterwards, Deb lifted her head with a jerk, and sniffed eagerly. At the same instant she heard a distant door bang. "Thank God!" she ejaculated, and flew to the windows that all day had to be shut tight against the furnace blast outside, and flung them wide, one after the other. The trees in the old garden were bending and rustling. The sweet, cool air came pouring in. "The wind has changed," she whispered, almost hysterically, to the nurse and the housekeeper, as they stealthily crept in, and, as they all gathered round the bed, "He is better already. His breathing is easier." The nurse bent over the long figure on the bed. "He is not breathing at all," said she. End of chapter 19. The 20 of Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Sisters by Ada Cambridge. Chapter 20. Jim Urquhart had been fighting bushfires for several days when the wind changed and carried them back over the burnt ground that extinguished them. When he rode home, dead beat, from helping a neighbour who had helped him, it was to meet the news that Mr Thornycroft was dead, and Mrs Urquhart gone to Redford to support Deborah Pennycuick. Mr Thornycroft had been ailing with his asthma so long, and making so little fuss about it, that his friends had come to regard him as practically ailing nothing. The death that had slowly stalked him for years came upon them with the shock of the unexpected, so the newspapers said. Jim's heart smote him for that he had been so taken up with the fire epidemic as to have neglected for over a week to inquire after the old man. It smote him more when he heard that Deb had been at Redford through the ordeal, without anyone near her. He had known too well, had made it his business to know, that she had had a struggling life, heartbreaking to think of for a long time, but under various pretexts she had kept everybody at arm's length and further, refusing aid or pity. Now there had come a chance to do something for her, and he had been out of the way, and duty still detained him to arrange about destroyed fences and foodless stock, duty that had to be considered first, even before her. When at last he was free to put himself at her disposal, a dozen men had jumped his claim. The manager of Redford met him when a few miles from the place. "You are behind the fair, Mr. Urquhart," cried he, as they drew rein alongside, and his tone and his face were strangely cheerful, considering that his good employer of 20 years had been buried only yesterday, as usual, within a few hours of his death. "But I suppose you have heard the news?" "What, you haven't? Then I am the first to congratulate you," extending a cordial hand. "The will was read this morning, and you've got the biggest legacy, a cool 5,000, sir." 5,000! Jim, never on particularly intimate terms with the testator, had not thought of the will, and the idea that he might have an interest in it never crossed his mind. 5,000! It is said of drowning people that they see the whole panorama of their lives in the last seconds of consciousness. In the instant's pause that followed the manager's announcement, Jim saw Five Creeks renovated and prosperous, and Deb's children running about the old rooms and paddocks, and calling him father, a home not quite unworthy of his goddess now, and one that loneliness and poverty would have taught her to appreciate. He stared at the burly manager like a man in a dream. "I get a nice little windfall myself, which I never expected," the latter continued his tale. "The servants are well provided for, and there are odd sums for a lot of English relatives. I suppose they are, and a good bit for charities. But yours is the biggest individual legacy, and I'm glad of it, and I'm not surprised, because I've heard him many a time speak well of you for the way you work to keep up your place and look after the family." "But," said Jim, coming down from his clouds of glory, I thought there'd be more than that." "Than what? You surely didn't expect Oh, I see." The manager threw up his head and roared. "My good fellow, the estate altogether is worth 250,000. Then who gets it? Miss Pennycuick. She's here now, and couldn't believe it when they told her, though, when you come to think of it, it was a natural thing for him to do, having been such friends with the old man, and she his goddaughter. A lucky young woman, my word." Jim's swelled heart collapsed and sank like a burst balloon. His dream house vanished in thin air, to be built no more. "That settles it," he said to himself. According to his code of manly honour and self-respect, a man could not possibly, even with £5,000 in hand, ask a girl with 250,000 to marry him. A little more conversation, if it can be called such, when one talked and the other did not even listen, and he parted with the garrulous manager and rode on to the house. Deb, wet-eyed, met him with a welcome that severely tried his Spartan fortitude, without in the least weakening his resolve. Although she did not know it, being still filled with grief for her lifelong friend, it was the power and command that he had endowed her with which gave the charming air of fearless and open affection to her manner. "Oh, my dear, dear boy!" she addressed him, and all but kissed him before his mother's eyes. "I am so glad to have you here. Jim dear, Mrs. Urquhart thinks you can be spared. Will you stay here for a bit, and help me to settle things? There is so much to do, and it is my duty to attend to everything myself. There are the lawyers and people, of course. Everybody is so kind, but I want a man of my own beside me." "Certainly, Deb," he replied, without wincing, "for as long as you want me. If I can run home every other day or so for a look round." He stayed, in company with his mother, for a month. Then, when he went to live at home again, he spent at least half his days at Redford, acting as Deb's own man, indoors and out, her real legal adviser, her real station manager, her confidential major domo. The doer of all the dirty work connected with the administration of her estate, and never, although she exposed him to almost every sort of temptation, never once stepped off the line that he had marked for himself. Another person was not so scrupulous, though, to be sure, he was not so poor. Claud Dalzell, drifting from one resort of the wealthy to another, deer stalking in Scotland, salmon fishing in Norway, shooting in the Rockies, hunting in the Shires, yachting everywhere, and everywhere adored of a crowd of women as idle as himself, was loafing at Monte Carlo when he heard of Mr. Thornycroft's death and Deb's accession to his throne. Ennui and satiety possessed the popular young man at the moment, for he was made for better things, and his dissatisfied soul tormented him, and a vision of old-time Redford and the beautiful girl who was like wine and fire, a blend of passion and purity that now impressed him as unique, rose before his mental eyes with the effect of water springs in a dry land. His thoughts went back to the days when they rode and made love together, the sunny days, before the clouds gathered. It was that past which glorified her all at once, not the present, not Mr. Thornycroft's money, not the halo of elegance and consequence that again adored her. He never suspected otherwise for a moment, and that was why he did not hesitate to book a passage to Australia that very day. Deb was at Redford when he arrived, that she would never part with the place again. She had declared on the day that it came into her possession, and she was now establishing herself there, she said, for life. She had gone through the whole great rambling house, sorting and rearranging the furniture that was in it, adding the cream of the contents of the best shops in town. She made a clean sweep of the now awful fittings of the big drawing room, replacing them with parquet rugs and divans, and things of the softest, finest, and most costly kind. She arranged the morning room for herself afresh, also the glazed corridor, which became a beautiful art gallery and lounging place, also the remainder of the long unused rooms. She called to her all the favourite old servants, except Keziah Moon, who was happy where she was, and old Miss Keene to play chaperon once more, with nothing to do but arrange flowers and doze at peace in the lap of luxury. Deb wanted Jim for her manager, at a ridiculous salary, but he would not take the post. He did, however, procure her an excellent substitute. She commissioned him to buy her riding horses. He knew what she liked, regardless of expense. An English groom was given charge of them when they arrived. So easily did the magnificent woman slide back into her magnificent ways, for all her good taste and unpretentiousness. When Claud Dalzell was driven in his hired buggy from the township to her door, his critical eye took in the many changes that the old homestead had undergone with high approval. Used as he was to far finer houses and the best of everything, he felt that here was as fair a camping place as ever he could desire. Redford, with $250,000 behind it, with this setting of sunshine and spaciousness, missed so much more than he had known till now. Inclined, what a haven of rest and pleasure, after the crowded and fatiguing experiences of his later years. He was shown upstairs to the big drawing room. He hardly knew where he was, with the grass green carpet and festooned window draperies and gliding and plate glass vanished, and these soft coloured stuffs and subtle harmonies around him. He could recognise nothing but a few pictures and the old piano, the latter spread with a gem of Chinese embroidery, on which stood a gem of a Satsuma bowl filled with fine chrysanthemums. It was late in autumn now, and while he wandered about, examining this and that with the pleasure of a satisfied connoisseur, Deb stood in the sitting room downstairs, with clenched hands and teeth, staring at his card on a table before her. He has the cheek, she thought, afire with indignation, never so hot and bitter as when directed against one we love who has offended us. He has the unspeakable effrontery to come and see me now, when he never came near me all those hard years, never cared how I muddled and struggled, nor whether I was alive or dead. But she must see him, of course, and she must maintain her proper dignity, no descending to vulgar reproaches, still less to weak condonation. She took a moment to calm herself, and walked forth to the interview. Many things upheld her, but the dead hand of Mr Thornycroft was her stoutest support. She needed it when she reached the top of the stairs. Facing the drawing room door, awaiting her, stood the figure that really seemed the one thing wanting to complete the beauty of the beautiful house. He had never in his younger days been so distinguished looking as he was now. In any company, in any part of the world, he must have attracted notice, as a gentleman, in person and manners, of the very finest type. And how she did love that sort! How her lonely and hungry heart longed for him when she saw him, the only man she had ever deemed her natural mate, and at the same time how she hated him for the disappointment and the humiliation that he had brought her. Outraged self-respect, her robust will-power, and her $250,000 sufficed to save her from a temptation she would not have fallen into for the world. She swept forward to shake hands with him, with the grave affability of a great lady to a guest, any guest, and it was plain from the expression of his sensitive face that he was as keenly appreciative of her enhanced beauty and finish as she of his. Black was not her colour, she was too dark, and she had discarded it for pale greys and whites, with touches of black about them. Today a creamy woolen, thick and soft, and hanging about her like the drapery of a Greek statue, was an inspiration in becoming gowns. The maid who had dressed her hair was a mistress of the art, and Miss Pennycuick's step and poise, well, she was a great lady, and carried herself accordingly. Her old lover was charmed. He held her hand, and would have held it thrice as long, and looked into her eyes, too overcome, it appeared, to speak. "How do you do?" she said, evading his intense gaze. "What a man you are for dropping on one in this unexpected, sensational way. Why didn't you write and tell me you were around?" She made a movement to withdraw her hand. He held it fast. "Debbie," said he, in quite a tremulous voice, remarkable in one constitutionally so self-confident and self-possessed. "Debbie, You turned me out of your house when I came to see you last. I hope you have a different welcome for me this time." "To the best of my belief," she laughed, "you insisted upon going. I am sure you were asked to stay to lunch, or whatever it was. By the way, have you lunched now?" She showed concern for her obligations as his hostess. "Yes, thank you. At least, it doesn't matter." He had to relinquish her hand, and when she immediately made towards the bell button, he followed and arrested her. "Let us have our talk first," he pleaded. "I don't want anything to eat until I know, until I feel that you don't grudge it." "Oh, I don't grudge it." She took him literally. "Not one square meal, at any rate. The only thing I am obliged to grudge is house, room, for any length of time, to single gentlemen. But that is not a question of hospitality, as you know. Sit down and tell me all the news." He sat down. She also, about 2 yards off. Across the gulf of Persian rug he looked at her steadily. "You are angry with me," he observed. "Why, Debbie? Is it still the old quarrel, after all these years?" Then her face changed like a filled lamp when you put a match to it. She said, in a deep, breathless way, "Do you know how many years it is?" More in sorrow and surprise than anger, he guessed her meaning after a moment's thought. "Is that my fault? The number of years has been of your choosing," he pointed out forbearingly. "You sent me away, when I never wanted to go. You broke it off, altogether against my wish. You never relented, never made a sign. Even now I come back, uninvited." It was a clear case, and all he asked for was bare justice. "Why didn't you come before, uninvited? Why didn't you come back to me when I was poor and lonely, Claud? I have been in every sort of trouble. My father is dead. I have lost all my sisters in one way and another. I have been living in cheap lodgings, doing without what I always thought were the necessaries of life, to keep Francie going and to get debts paid off. I have been ill. I have been unhappy. I have sometimes been penniless. And you have carefully passed by on the other side, like that man in the Bible, and left me to my fate." He was genuinely shocked. He knew that she had been horribly down in the world, but not that she had suffered to this extent. Seeing her sitting there in her beautiful gown, in her beautiful room, without one trace of those sordid years about her, his heart ached to think of them. "My darling, I never knew." "Why not?" she said swiftly. "Because you never tried to know, never cared to know. But now that I can be a credit to you again, the moment you hear that I have had a great fortune left to me, now you come back." "Do you mean to say," he demanded sternly, "that you honestly think I have come back to you on account of your money?" She returned his cold, searching gaze in kind. "Honestly," she said, "I do think so. There is no way out of it." He rose deliberately, bowed to her, and picked up his hat. He was not really mercenary, or, if he was, he did not know it, and he was as intensely proud as she was. He felt that he had received the deadliest insult ever dealt him in his life, and one that he could never forget or forgive. Without another word, he turned to the door and walked out. She stood still and watched him go, a calm smile curving her lips, a very cyclone of passion tearing through her heart, and she scorned to recall him. Chapter 20.